They gathered to sing, not knowing the hymn would be their last. Witnesses swore the choir's voices carried beyond the cathedral walls into the night sky itself. But by morning, the pews were empty. Their robes lay folded. Their song was still echoing. No doors were opened. No footprints remained. The faithful had vanished into their own devotion, and the church would never admit what the darkness had taken. The camera drifts across rolling fields, pale grass bending under a patient wind, mist clinging low, as if unwilling to let go. At the far edge of the countryside, where the road ends in mud and silence, an abbey still stands, weathered, heavy with years. Its stone is the color of bone, streaked by rain and darkened by lichen. From a distance it looks abandoned. No lanterns in the windows, no bells calling to worship, only walls sealed against time. But the locals remember something different. They remember sound. It was not the sermons, nor the tolling of the bells that gave the abbey its name. It was the choir, voices so pure that parish records described them as medicine, notes that carried grief out of the body like smoke, a sound that seemed to repair what sorrow had broken. Each evening, after the sun sank and the fields emptied, the choir would gather, not weekly, not at festival, but every single night. The music would begin faint, almost secret, as though rehearsed only for themselves. But before long it would rise, climbing, swelling, filling the chapel, until it pressed against the walls, as if trying to escape, and escape it did. Villagers claim the sound traveled further than the air should allow, past hedges and farm walls, across the river, into homes where no hymn had ever entered before. Windows would rattle, animals would stir, and still the choir sang. Some say the voices belonged to no more than 30 brothers. Others claim there were 50, or even more, though no record of such numbers survives. But one thing is clear. The sound was larger than its source. It drew people in. Travelers arriving at dusk would pause, hearing it from the road. Strangers on horseback dismounted, stunned, as though the music clutched their chest. Many followed it, expecting to find festival or feast, and yet few remained. Accounts are vague, scattered in letters and journals. A woman from a neighboring village wrote that she visited once, drawn by the sound that reached her home. She stayed through a single hymn. She left before dawn, vowing never to return. Her words are brief, almost evasive. She describes the singing as too much, not in volume, but in presence, as though the notes pressed into her mind and remained there, echoing long after the voices had stopped. Others echoed her sentiment, drawn by beauty, repelled by something else. No one could say precisely what, but something wasn't right. The abbey itself told another story. Even in the height of the choir's reputation, no one described it as welcoming. The doors, heavy and iron-bound, seemed more suited to a fortress than a house of prayer. The windows were narrow, not generous. Light entered in thin slivers, leaving the nave dim even at noon. And inside, the air was colder than the fields outside, always, even in summer. The sound then did not match the place. Joyful voices rising from stone that seemed carved for silence. That dissonance unsettled visitors. One merchant, traveling with goods, claimed that the music followed him for miles after he left. Not loud, not constant, but present, a single line of melody repeating in his mind, until he could no longer recall whether it had ended or not. He never returned to that route, and yet the choir continued. Every night, relentless, the parish records, sparse but consistent, described the gatherings in plain clerical language. Brothers convened at vespers, choir sang, until completion of the service. Attendance noted, full, but between the lines, a pattern appears. The entries grow shorter, the handwriting thinner, as if the man recording them no longer wished to do so, until after several months, the entries stop entirely. No explanation, no closing line, just silence. What happened in those walls cannot be known with certainty, but the traces left behind suggest something deeper than song, because those who visited never forgot. A farmer who claimed to have heard it as a boy described the memory. Decades later, he said it was beautiful, so beautiful he could hardly breathe, and yet, when asked why he never went back, his face darkened. He could not explain, only that the sound felt alive, as though it was listening as much as it was singing. And that's when he heard it. The details slipped from him without warning. He said, in the pause between notes, he heard something else, not silence, but breath, a collective inhale that did not belong to human throats. He stopped speaking then, refused to finish, and left the interview unfinished. It is easy to dismiss such claims as memory's trick, easy to say the mind bends sound when it cannot comprehend. But when accounts from separate decades speak of the same unease, the same pressure, the same refusal to return, the pattern grows harder to ignore. The abbey became known, not for its worshippers, nor its relics, nor its priests, but only for that choir, a place where voices rose higher than stone, and yet left a silence no one could bear to face again. Today, its doors remain closed, the walls hold their quiet, but the land remembers. Walk the fields on certain nights, and some say you can still feel it, not hear, but feel. A vibration beneath the soil, a hum in the chest, the ghost of sound without source, and once you notice it, you cannot escape it. The forgotten abbey watches, waiting, its windows dark, but its silence is not empty, because silence here was always the loudest sound of all. The camera lingers on the abbey's cloister, arched stone corridors, shadows folding in on themselves, the echo of footsteps, long vanished. Inside these walls lived the choir, 30 men and women, not performers, not artists, but vessels. They were not chosen for skill, but for devotion, for the steadiness of their faith, for their willingness to vanish into the act of praise. Each morning began with silence, then fasting, a ritual hunger meant to sharpen their voices, to make them lighter, closer to heaven. Confession followed. Every day, every single day, they lined the chapel pews before the priest, heads bowed, mouths dry, offering up each stray thought, each doubt, each passing shadow of temptation. No sin was too small, no thought was too fleeting. Because the choir was not permitted to carry secrets, their purity was part of the music. Without it, the hymn would collapse. The discipline was absolute. They spoke little outside of song. They ate only bread, roots, and broth. Their nights were short, their mornings early. Some say they never laughed, and yet, when the music began, their voices bloomed. It was not rehearsed like a performance. It was a prayer, drilled until it lived in their marrow. Every note exact, every harmony fixed, no improvisation, no deviation. The abbey's leaders gave only one warning, one rule that stood above the rest: never alter the final note. The hymn, ancient in origin, closed always with the same descent, a fall from light into silence, a sound meant to fold the song into itself, to close what had been opened, to end without residue, and so it was done. Night after night, the same cadence, the same descent, until it became instinct. But something wasn't right, because devotion, however strict, does not erase the mind. It does not silence curiosity. And among 30 voices, there were questions. What would happen if the hymn did not end as it always had? What would it sound like if the descent was stretched, or lifted, or reshaped into something new? They asked it quietly, not aloud, but within themselves. in the silence of fasting, in the dim of confession, in the restless hours before dawn. At first, the thought was fleeting, a whisper no one acknowledged, but thoughts have weight, and in silence, they grow heavier. One singer, his name absent from the records, was the first to break. He lingered at practice, held the final note half a breath longer, barely noticeable, but the others heard it. They looked to him, and in their faces was not anger, but recognition, because they had thought it too, and that was the beginning. Small shifts, barely perceptible, a note rounded, a pause stretched, a harmony layered, where none belonged, always at the end, always on the last note. The priest who oversaw their practice wrote of it once, in the margin of his ledger. The voices wander where they should not, no further explanation, no correction, just the line. But something had changed. The music once described as pure began to feel heavier. Those who listened in the nave wrote that their hearts raced, that the air itself seemed thicker. They left unsettled, not comforted, not healed, but disturbed. The brothers and sisters of the choir did not stop. They pushed further, longer descents, sharper rises, turning the hymn into something the abbey had never sanctioned. They told themselves it was still praise, that God himself would not mind a final note bent toward beauty. But beauty was not what they found. One night, the change became undeniable. As the hymn drew to its close, the voices did not descend. They rose together, higher than they had ever gone. The sound struck the rafters, it struck the walls, it shook the glass in its frames, and then it held, a single note, suspended, unnatural in its length. Visitors in the pews wrote later that they could not breathe. Their lungs refused it, as though the note had stolen the air, and that's when he heard it. A young novice, tasked with ringing the bells, claimed that beneath the harmony was something else, a vibration, not from voices, not from organ, not from earth. It was felt more than heard, a pressure in the chest, like standing too close to thunder. He fled before the hymn ended. Others remained, paralyzed. The note finally broke. The silence that followed was not relief. It was collapse. The choir staggered, drained. Some wept, some clutched their throats, unable to swallow, but none admitted what had happened. The abbey records are silent on that night. No entry, no mention, only rumors that after it ended, one of the choir refused to return, that he left the abbey before dawn, walking barefoot into the fields, and was never seen again.
The others carried on, but the hymn was no longer what it had been. The warning against altering the final note had been broken, and once broken, it could not be restored. The choir could not unhear the sound they had made. They could not forget the silence that followed. From that night, devotion became obsession. They sang, not for worship, but for the pursuit of that impossible note. And though the abbey doors remained closed to the world, the music inside grew stranger, fuller, darker. Parish records from neighboring villages speak of sleepless nights, of animals restless in their pens, of children waking with blood at their noses. The abbey kept no such notes. Their pages remained blank, but outside its walls, the world shifted, and within 30 voices sang towards something they could not name, something they could not stop. The devotion that once kept them pure had become the very thing that consumed them, and from that night forward, the hymn was never the same. The fields sleep beneath a veil of dusk. Crows drift low, their wings black against the sky. The abbey waits at the horizon, its windows cold, its stones breathing silence, and then the singing begins. At first it is familiar, the 30 voices, trained and sharpened by hunger and prayer, the sound that spills into the night, like water over stone. But to the villagers listening from their cottages, something has changed. The music is fuller, wider, a weight presses into the chest, as though the air has grown dense. They hear voices, yes, but not 30 more. Some are high, almost breaking the edge of sound. Others fall deep, lower than the human throat should allow. They overlap, climbing over one another, swelling, turning the hymn into something vast and uncountable. But something wasn't right, because when the villagers counted, they found no one missing. The abbey doors had opened that afternoon. They had seen the choir, 30 faces, no more. And yet, when the song rose, there were others among them, unseen, unnamed. One farmer, standing in his yard, claimed he heard his dead wife's voice, clear, sharp, singing words he did not recognize. Another villager swore he heard his child's laughter woven into the hymn, though the boy lay sleeping beside him, and that's when he heard it. A tone so foreign, it split the night in two, not voice, not instrument, but something carried between them. He fell to his knees. The sound pressed him down until his forehead touched the dirt. He could not rise until it ended. The abbey drew them in. On singing nights, villagers who had once avoided the place found themselves walking the narrow road, not in groups, but alone. As though summoned, they filled the nave, shoulder to shoulder, breathless, waiting, and the music came. It surged against the stone, so strong that plaster cracked in the walls, so strong that wax fell in ribbons from the candles, so strong that the listeners swayed, as though drunk. Some fainted where they stood, their bodies limp in the aisles, faces pale, hands twitching. Others convulsed, seized without warning, their heels striking the floor, their mouths foaming, as though they had swallowed salt. And still the choir sang on. No one broke rhythm, no one moved to help. They continued as though the collapse of bodies at their feet was part of the hymn itself. Witnesses described moments, strangers still. A young girl, no older than 12, rose mid-hymn and spoke, not words she knew, not words anyone recognized, but a language, rapid and fluid, tumbling from her throat. When she fell silent, her eyes rolled back. She remembered nothing, but another man, trembling in the pews, found himself repeating a phrase over and over, the phrase in no known tongue. His voice cracked, bled, then fell still. For hours afterward, he could not speak his own name. The villagers called it blessing, others called it curse, but no one denied what they had seen. No one denied what they had heard. Letters written from the valley described the same pattern. Those who lingered too long beneath the song did not leave unchanged. Some slept for days, some woke screaming, some refused to return to their homes, claiming their walls hummed with the same tones. One woman swore her newborn child began to coo in rhythm with the hymn. Though the abbey stood miles away, suspicion grew, not only among the villagers, but within the clergy themselves. A visiting priest from the city attended one night, summoned by the reports. He lasted less than an hour. At first he stood firm, lips tight, fingers on his rosary, but as the hymn climbed, he began to shake. His eyes darted, searching the rafters, the walls, as though the voices came from everywhere at once. He clutched his ears. He fell to the floor. Witnesses said he shouted, not in prayer, but in panic. He begged for the music to stop. His words were clear. These are not voices of men. He left before dawn. He never returned. But the choir sang on. Night after night, their devotion burned hotter. They fasted harder. They confessed longer. They gave themselves to the hymn, as though it was no longer prayer, but command. The villagers followed, despite the fear, drawn by something they could not name. Even those who collapsed returned. Once they woke, even those who bled at the mouth sat again in the pews, as though the hymn itself had taken root inside them. That horror crept deeper, because in the quiet between notes, they heard it. Whispers, not loud, not clear, but present, threads of sound, braided into the hymn. too faint to be sung, too deliberate to be accident. Some swore the whispers spoke directly to them, calling their names, repeating their confessions, answering questions they had never voiced aloud. A boy of 15 fled the abbey in the middle of service. When asked why, he stammered only this: "It knew me." The hymn knew him, and from then on, he would not step foot near the road again. The abbey's walls bore the strain. Cracks widened, glass warped. The building itself seemed to bow under the pressure of 30 voices and the countless others carried within them. But the choir did not break. If anything, they grew stronger. The fasting lengthened, the confessions deepened, their bodies thinned, but their voices swelled. It was as though the more they gave, the more the hymn demanded, and the villagers, terrified, enthralled, unable to resist, gave themselves to. By the end of that season, the nave was full each night. Children, elders, farmers, strangers, faces pale, eyes wide, waiting for collapse, and collapse came. One evening, as the hymn reached its close, nearly a dozen fell at once. Some shook with seizures, some lay still, their lips moving in languages no one recognized. One woman stood rigid, arms outstretched, her voice joining the choir, though she had never sung a note in her life. When it ended, she fell lifeless to the floor. The abbey bells tolled only once that night. No record remains of her burial. The whispers in the song had grown louder, too loud to ignore, and the line between human voice and something else had broken completely. The villagers had begun as witnesses, but now they were part of it, and the silence that followed each hymn was no longer silence at all. It was listening. The nave glows faintly with candlelight. Wax drips in slow rivulets down the altar stand. Shadows stretch long across the stone, as if pulled towards something unseen. The choir gathers, as they always do, 30 voices, thin with fasting, hollow-eyed with devotion. Their robes hang loose from their shoulders. Their lips are cracked, but their posture is upright, their discipline absolute. The hymn begins. The first note steady, rehearsed, familiar. The sound rises slowly, weaving together, lifting against the arches overhead. For a moment, it is almost beautiful, but something wasn't right. Halfway through the hymn, one of the singers falters. A man, his name missing from the records, staggers, clutching his chest. His voice fractures, falls away. The others continue without him. He drops to his knees, gasps for air. His fingers claw at his robe, as though something is pressing down on him. And then he whispers, "I hear her." At first no one reacts. The choir holds the note, their eyes fixed on the choirmaster's hand, but his voice grows louder, choked, desperate. "My mother, she's in it. She's calling me." He collapses fully, his body striking the stone floor with a hollow crack. The music does not stop. The choirmaster gives no signal. The hymn carries on as though his fall is nothing, as though the prayer itself demands sacrifice. And that's when he heard it. One of the novices later swore that in the moment, the man struck the floor. The harmony thickened, not with 30 voices, but with 31. He could not say what words it carried, only that the tone was not human, and that once he noticed it, he could not unhear it. The collapsed singer writhed. He tried to sit, tried to speak, but the words twisted. They bent into something unrecognizable, half Latin, half broken syllable, none of it his own. The hymn ended. The silence that followed was worse. The man lay shaking, eyes wide, chest heaving. He whispered once more, "I saw her face in the sound." He was carried from the chapel. The others remained, still as statues, but fear had entered them. In the days that followed, the unease spread. Others began to notice things they had ignored before. One woman confessed that during practice, she saw faces in the candle flames, not brief flickers, not tricks of the eye, but detailed faces, mouths moving, eyes fixed on her. Some she recognized, most she did not. She tried to close her eyes during rehearsal, but the faces remained,
floating behind her eyelids, mouthing words she could not hear. Another man claimed he felt breath on his ear, mid him, a warm exhale, though no one stood near him. When he turned, there was nothing, only the sound of 30 voices pressed into stone. The confessions grew darker, hands trembling, voices cracking. They told the chormaster of shadows that moved differently than the bodies that cast them, of hearing names called in the rests between notes, of seeing lips move even when voices were still. But the chormaster forbade silence. He warned them that doubt was weakness, that fear was temptation, that only discipline could hold the hymn together. Sing, he commanded, do not stop, no matter what you hear, no matter what you see. And so they obeyed. Night after night, they lifted their voices, even as terror hollowed them.
Even as their bodies shook, even as one by one their eyes dimmed with exhaustion. But something had changed. The collapse of one singer had opened a door, and now, no matter how tightly the chormaster gripped at the rhythm, the choir could not close it again. Each note carried something beneath it, a whisper, a murmur, a presence. The singers knew it. The villagers who listened knew it. Even the walls of the abbey seemed to know it, bearing cracks that grew wider with each hymn. And though the chormaster forbade silence, the silence itself had begun to sing. The fog clung low to the valley that night, a river of mist snaking between darkened fields. The abbey rose ahead, a silhouette against the dying light, stone pale as bone. A villager approached, alone, feet careful on the wet earth, hands shoved into sleeves, heart hammering in his chest like a drum. He had watched from afar for weeks. The singing drew him closer each night. Curiosity gnawed at him, a hunger he could not name. The doors loomed, heavy, iron-bound, immovable in appearance, but a narrow gap, hidden beneath the latch, welcomed him inside. The nave was darker than he expected. Candles flickered along the walls, shadows pooled in corners. The air smelled of wax, damp stone, and something older, something that had never left these walls. The choir was in place, 30 voices, rising, but he noticed something first. The sound had weight. It pressed down, filled every inch of the nave, and then it grew. He froze, because the sound was coming from everywhere, not only the 30 singers, not only the organ, but from above, circling overhead, de-echoing off the rafters. And yet, when he looked, there was nothing. No choir above, no instruments, no living thing moving there at all. But the sound kept coming, and that's when he heard it. Voices, many more than 30, spiraling around him, harmonies impossible for any human throat, laughter and sobs stitched into the hymn, whispers threading through the cadence. He stumbled backward, his knees hitting the stone floor. Hands clutched the hem of his tunic, eyes wide, breath coming too fast. Shadows moved, not in the way shadows follow light, but with purpose, flickering along beams, folding into corners, stretching across the ceiling. They sang, or so it seemed, mouth-shaped sound that should not have existed, yet the notes reached his ears as clearly as the choir's. He tried to flee, but the nave seemed longer than it was, the exit farther away than memory suggested. The walls shifted subtly, the shadows growing with every step. He fell to the floor, pressed his palms to his ears. The harmony circled him still, tangled him in its web. A candle guttered, its light danced. In the flicker, he thought he saw faces, pale, unblinking, rising from the pews, staring, silent, yet moving in time with the music. Recognizable faces from his village, neighbors, friends, people who had never entered the abbey. And that's when he heard it again, his own voice, singing the hymn, though he had not moved his lips, echoing from somewhere high above, alongside the shadows, a note not in his memory, a syllable he had never learned. Panic broke him. He bolted for the door, feet slipping on wet stone,
his heart hammering. Pure echo behind him, a voice calling his name. Outside, the fog had thickened. He could barely see the abbey for what it was, but he ran across fields, through hedges, past the river, and did not stop until the sound, distant but still palpable, had faded to a whisper. When he returned to the village, he tried to tell them, tried to explain what he had seen, tried to warn them, but the villagers were skeptical. They had heard the singing too. Yes, they had felt its weight, but few had ventured so close. Few had seen the shadows. Few had heard their own voices among the choir. He spoke anyway. His hands shook, his eyes darted, as though the shadows might follow him. "They are not just singing," he said. "They are taking something from the walls, from the rafters, from the air, and they are calling it back." Some nodded nervously, some laughed politely, but all left uneasily. Meanwhile, the choir continued, oblivious, or perhaps indifferent, to the terror outside. Inside the abbey, they sang with the same discipline as always, but the notes had changed. The faint echo lingered after each chord, a tremor in the stone, something waiting in the spaces between voices. The villager could not stop thinking about it, could not sleep, could not forget the way the shadows had moved, the way his own voice had betrayed him. He returned nights later, cautiously, from the edge of the valley. The abbey seemed smaller, yet the music reached further than ever, and he noticed something new. The windows glowed faintly, though no candles had been lit, and in that glow, shadows gathered along the stone, still watching, singing along. He turned to leave, heart hammering, mind screaming, and the choir, 30 voices strong, sang on. But now, their hymn had an extra layer, impossible, unseen, uncountable. He fled again, but the memory followed him. Every echo of the song, a weight pressing on his chest. Every shadow from the rafters, a finger in his mind. The villagers listened for the music each night. They heard it, but they did not approach. They left offerings at the road's edge. A loaf of bread, a jug of wine, a candle, flickering in hope or fear, queue inside the abbey. The choir was not worried. They knew no pause, no rest, no silence. And the villager, marked by what he had witnessed, knew what they would do next. They would sing, until nothing else remained. A fog pressed against the hills that night. The abbey loomed beyond the trees, stone pale and wet, like bone left in rain. Smoke rose from village chimneys, curling toward the dark sky, as if fleeing the shadows gathering ahead. The faithful gathered at the doors, families, neighbors, strangers drawn by the music, the stories, the promise of something holy. They whispered quietly, scanning the nave, through candle-lit windows. Hearts thumped in nervous rhythm, hands gripped coats, shawls, and rosaries alike. Inside, the choir took their places, 30 voices, worn from fasting, devotion, discipline, eyes closed, lips dry, bodies trembling. The choirmaster raised his hands. No signal passed between them, no glance, no nod, only the stillness before sound. And then it began. The hymn rose slow and deliberate, notes stretched, held, folded into themselves. The air grew thick, candles flickered, shadows twisting along stone. Every wall seemed to breathe with the music. At first it was familiar. The faithful leaned forward in their pews, imagining comfort, imagining grace, but the sound changed. Subtle at first, a tremor beneath the floorboards, a pulse beneath the walls, as if the ground itself awaited something, but something wasn't right. The final note, the one they had always held sacred, was not as it should be. The choir faltered for an instant, a half beat, and then, deliberately, they altered it. The sound deepened, the ground shook beneath the nave. Candles guttered, extinguishing one by one, plunging the faithful into darkness. And that's when he heard it. Whispers, not from any voice he recognized, but from the hymn itself, calling, naming, every listener's name, woven into the harmony, softly at first, then louder. A woman screamed, hands pressed to her ears, her knees buckled, others looked around, eyes wide, some could not move. The sound pressed against them. It pressed down, filled every corner, rifled through memories, tugged at old regrets, names, sins forgotten, confessions, all returning, as note after note. The choirmaster's face remained impassive. He gestured only for continuation. The hymn demanded no pause, no breath, no mercy. A man fell to the floor, clutching his chest. He moaned a single name. His sister's. She had died decades earlier. He had buried the memory carefully, but the hymn had not forgotten. The ceiling groaned under unseen pressure. Shadows moved like liquid along the beams. Faces appeared in the darkness, pale and open-mouthed, not living, not human, yet their expressions mirrored the terror of those below. Some fainted, some convulsed, some screamed incoherently, their voices merging with the altered hymn in a chorus that was not meant to exist. Outside, villagers pressed against doors. They could hear the sound, feel it in their bones, and some swore they could hear voices familiar and impossible at once, calling their names across the stone walls. Inside, the choir sang on, bodies trembling, lips cracked, eyes wide and unblinking. The altered note held, longer than any human throat could endure. It resonated in the bones. It vibrated in the air. It filled the space between stone and flesh. And then silence, absolute, thick, the kind of silence that tastes of ash and fear. For a heartbeat, the faithful thought it was over, but the hymn had not ended. It had changed, and the silence itself began to crack. Screams erupted, rising from mouths open in horror, from throats that had not intended to make sound, from bodies writhing on cold stone floors. The voices dissolved into air, each scream fading before it could carry meaning, leaving only the echo of something unnameable behind. The choir staggered, leaning on one another. Some wept, some whispered names that were no longer their own. The choirmaster remained, hand trembling now, though his expression never broke. The discipline had held, but the cost was written on every face. Candles were relit, slowly, flickering against walls now blackened with smoke. The faithful stumbled out, shaken, haunted, marked by what they had heard. No one spoke of the names whispered in their ears. No one mentioned the faces in the shadows, but all remembered, because the hymn had reached further than song. It had touched the marrow. It had left a weight inside the chest, a vibration that would not leave. Outside, the fog returned, settling on fields and roads, and in the valley, the abbey waited, its doors closed, its stones heavy with memory, and somewhere within, the choir, 30 voices, altered, unbroken, practiced again, perfecting a final note that no one outside could survive. The first light of dawn crawled across the valley. Mist clung to the fields, cold and stubborn. The abbey loomed beyond the hedgerows, its stone glistening with dew. Villagers approached cautiously, eyes wide, hands shaking. The road to the doors felt longer than it had the night before. Inside the names was a ruin, pews overturned, hymnals scattered like autumn leaves. Candles once alight lay burnt to their stubs. The air was thick with the smell of wax and dust.
But there were no bodies. None. Not a single choir member remained. No traces of the faithful who had attended the mass. Only silence. And that's when they noticed the robes, folded neatly at the altar, not tossed, not disturbed, arranged with a precision that was almost reverent. See, as if prepared for burial. But no one had been buried. A tremor ran through the witnesses. Some clutched one another. Some fell to their knees. They spoke in whispers, but the words faltered and fell into the air, because the echoes remained. Voices, the hymn, the final note altered, lingering, reverberating, circling the nave. It had no source, no living throat to produce it, and yet it sang. Villagers pressed closer, eyes darting to the shadows in the corners, hands gripping each other. Each footstep sounded like a drum in the vast emptiness. One man claimed he could hear individual names whispered within the lingering harmony, names of those who had vanished the night before, names he had known, and even some he had not. The silence between notes felt heavier than the sound itself. It hung like a weight, a suffocating presence, but the choir robes remained, folded, clean, as if the singers had stepped out of their bodies, willingly, leaving only their instruments of devotion behind. A woman, trembling, pointed to the altar. "Look," she whispered, "even the choir's candles, all extinguished, yet the wax is still warm, as if they just left." And there it was, that subtle impossibility that made the air itself shiver. Some villagers tried to move closer, to examine the robes. One reached out a trembling hand, but it felt wrong, cold, and the echo of the hymn seemed to push back, vibrating in his chest. He pulled away, falling backward. The sound circled him. Names, syllables, notes unformed, yet precise, threading through the stone. Days passed. The echoes did not fade. For 3 days, the hymn persisted, outside the abbey, over the fields, through the misted streets of the village. People reported hearing it in their sleep, in their waking hours, in the quiet of their homes. And still, no living voice carried it. Some tried to leave the village. They claimed the sound followed, whispered their names, rattled windows, pressed against doors that were bolted tight. Others stayed, frozen by terror, mesmerized by the impossible continuity. Some wrote journals, some left offerings along the road, a loaf of bread, a jug of water, a candle flickering in hope or fear. Inside the abbey, the walls bore witness. Cracks deepened, stones shifted subtly. The shadows of the previous night stretched long in the dawn. They were silent, but alive. Those who dared to step inside claimed they could feel the music beneath their feet, rising from the floorboards, threading through the pews, curling along the walls. It pressed against the chest, tugged at the throat, and sometimes, just sometimes, they thought they saw movement. A flicker of a robe in the corner, a shadow sliding along the stone. But the abbey remained empty. No one remained to sing. No one remained to witness. The faithful outside whispered of madness, of curses, of what could consume a person and leave only memory and echo. And yet, the hymn endured. Every note stretched and folded into the next. Every name uttered in tones no living tongue could replicate. The final altered note, a single vibration, lingering, demanding, eternal. By the 3rd day, the villagers no longer approached the doors. The abbey became a monument to absence, a place of fear, memory, and impossible sound. Those who survived the Mass spoke of it in hushed tones. Letters, diaries, and oral accounts claimed, "They are gone, but the song remains. We heard it when we left. We hear it now, and it will not end." The empty nave swallowed time. Candles melted into waxed pools. Dust settled on overturned hymnals. The robes remained, folded, untouched, and the echoes, 30 voices, multiplied and impossible, reverberated without end. A hymn for no one, sung by none, yet haunting all who lived beyond its walls. The abbey waits still, its doors closed, its stones heavy with memory, its emptiness full, and in the quiet between wind and stone, the faithful who dared approach swear they hear a faint note rise, calling their names. Mist hovered low over the valley as the first sun struck the abbey.
Stone glistened faintly with moisture, and the air carried the smell of wet earth and ash. The village remained hushed, cautious, a tight hold of silence over the events of the previous nights. A procession of carriages arrived along the winding road, men in black robes, inked with the seal of the diocese, faces pale, expressions unreadable. They disembarked, carrying ledgers, ink, and a sense of authority that pressed on the air like a physical weight. Inside the nave, the wreckage remained. Pews overturned, candle stubs blackened and charred, robes folded neatly at the altar, untouched. The echoes lingered faintly in the corners, almost audible to the newcomers. The investigators moved through the space with careful detachment. Not a word to the villagers, not a pause for wonder, only the meticulous recording of what could be documented. Scorch marks, dislodged stones, the precise placement of the choir robes. A local priest attempted to explain. His voice trembled. He spoke of the final hymn, the voices, the names whispered within the song. He described shadows moving in the nave. The investigators listened, made notes, and nodded, and then issued a report. An unfortunate dispersal, they said. No further investigation warranted. But the village knew better. Those who protested, who demanded truth, were silenced. Letters vanished from desks. Oral complaints led to warnings. Some were quietly excommunicated, their names erased from parish registers, their confessions voided. And yet, rumor persisted. Whispers claimed that Rome had ordered the abbey bricked shut, its doors sealed with iron and mortar, the organ dismantled and removed, every note it could have produced taken from the walls. But the echoes did not vanish. Some villagers swore that at night, from beyond the bricked windows, the faint sound of the hymn carried 30 voices, or more folded into stone, calling, naming, pressing against the walls. The investigators' reports were cold, formal, clinical. They reduced horror to a phrase, unfortunate dispersal, and that phrase spread across the diocese like a protective seal. Nothing further to see, nothing further to question. But the witnesses remembered. One man, hiding in the valley beyond the abbey, reported that even as bricks sealed the doors, the echoes rose through the fog. He described a vibration in the ground, a sound threading through the trees, names whispered, syllables impossible, lingering in the throat of the night. And that's when he heard it. A voice faint, fractured, calling his own name, not human, not earthly, and yet intimately familiar. Some tried to leave the village. The echoes followed, in the wind, in the quiet of their homes, through the cracks in doors, through their dreams. Inside the abbey, the silence was deceptive. The organ, gone, the pews overturned, the robes still folded, and yet something pressed against the stone, something unseen, but attentive. The diocese dismissed the accounts, published official statements, archived the reports, declared the matter closed. But families of the faithful knew better. They spoke quietly, at night, of the names they had heard, of the notes that lingered beyond human capacity, of shadows that moved along the bricked walls. A young priest, newly assigned to the parish, recorded in his journal, "The abbey waits, the song waits. We cannot silence it. We cannot enter. We cannot leave." And though the doors were sealed, the weight of what had occurred remained. The fear, the memory, the impossible sound, all pressed against the minds of those who had witnessed. Outside, the fog never fully lifted. The valley remained cold. The village grew quieter, and the abbey loomed, bricked, silent. But the faithful and the curious knew the truth. No authority could erase sound from memory. No seal could prevent a voice from echoing. No decree could stop the shadows from lingering. The diocese had denied, but denial could not end the hymn. And those who remembered, those who listened too closely, carried it forward. Every whisper, every echo, every impossible note, waiting. The fog lingered like a living thing, curling through the streets and alleys of the village. It pressed against door frames and seeped beneath thresholds. The morning air smelled faintly of damp stone, ash, and a memory that refused to fade. Families moved cautiously through their homes, curtains drawn, windows shuttered. The faintest sound, a creak of floorboards, a shifting of wind, made hearts quicken. Even in silence, the echo of the abbey haunted them, not as music, not as song, but as memory of sound pressed into flesh. Father Benoit remained silent. His vow was total. No word escaped his lips. No confession passed through his mouth. He walked the village slowly, hands folded over his chest, eyes downward, every gesture deliberate, every step measured. And yet, the villagers felt his presence as pressure, a heavy awareness of something that had seen beyond them, something that had heard too much, something that would never let them forget. The widow in the attic trembled constantly. Each night, she lay awake, listening for the faintest trace of the hymn. At first it came as a whisper, then as a resonance that vibrated through the rafters. Her hands shook as she pressed them to her ears, but she could not escape. The sound traveled through walls, through windows, through dreams. She began to talk to herself, softly at first. Names, syllables, notes she had never heard in her life. Her family worried, but could offer no comfort. The hymn had already rewritten reality. One man, a carpenter, tried to return to work. He attempted to carve a pew for the church, but every hammer strike echoed with the notes of the final hymn. Every chisel cut reverberated with syllables, twisting his mind. He dropped his tools and ran from the workshop, muttering names that were not his own. And that's when he heard it, the faint impossible hum threading through the timber and stone of his home, calling him, naming him. The final note pressed against his chest and twisted in his stomach. He could not speak, he could not move, only tremble and pray silently. Though words failed him, children stopped attending Mass. Parents claimed the walls hummed at night, repeating the hymn in impossible ways. Even the young could not endure it. They awoke screaming, clutching their ears, eyes wide with terror that could not be soothed. Neighboring villages heard whispers of the abbey's sound. Though the doors were bricked, though the organ was gone, the echo pressed outward, a thread of terror reaching through stone, fog and memory.
In one home, a young couple huddled together. They had attempted normal life, meals, conversation, chores, but even in their quiet, they heard the notes threading through the walls, a voice, a harmony, impossibly familiar, and yet not of this world. It whispered names. Their names. A man, once a devout parishioner, set fire to his home. Flames licked the timbers. Smoke coiled in the fog-heavy air. Neighbors called for help, but he pushed them away. The walls, he shouted, they sing at night. He did not survive the flames. In the streets, silence grew heavy. Families no longer gathered at the church. The priests who had survived wandered aimlessly, eyes flicking to corners, hands trembling. Confessions went unheard. Hymns became tremors of memory. Even those who did not enter the abbey could feel it, a vibration beneath their feet, a hum threading through their homes, a resonance that pressed on the chest, tugged at the throat, and names they recognized, names they did not, whispered in tones they could not comprehend. One elderly woman swore she saw shadows moving across the bricked windows, figures resembling the vanished choir. singing silently. She tried to speak of it, but neighbors told her it was grief, a trick of fog and imagination. But she knew better. The sound did not lie. Father Benoit moved through the village silently. He passed the carpenter's abandoned tools. He passed the burned house, still smoldering. He passed the widow's shuttered windows, and he prayed, silently, though the words would not come. The abbey waited, bricked, silent, yet full, its stones heavy with memory, its walls vibrating with a final note that refused to die. Then the survivors, those who had witnessed, those who had endured, felt themselves unraveling. The quiet madness took root, not explosive, not sudden, but slow, a creeping awareness that the hymn had claimed more than space. It had claimed thought, memory, faith itself. The village council attempted to restore order, to meetings held in daylight, attempts to resume mass, but the walls, even of the smaller chapels, hummed faintly, notes pressing against consciousness. Every declaration of normalcy faltered under impossible sound. But one boy, barely 10, drew circles in chalk across his floor. He insisted the notes would be caught inside the shapes. His parents despaired, but allowed him to continue. For a moment it kept him from hearing the hymn in the walls. In another home, a family burned their hymnals. Pages went up in smoke, ash scattered into the fog, and yet the notes persisted. Tinny emerged from cracks in floorboards, through gaps in doors, even through the open sky, carried faintly on the wind. Priests attempted sermons, voices cracked, words faltered. The faithful could not hear beyond the resonance pressing inside their chests. The young man walked along the river, hoping the water would wash the sound away. He thought he was alone, but the hymn followed, pressed into the mist. He fell to his knees, clutching his ears, tears streaming, and that's when he heard it, his own name, spoken by voices that could not exist, a choir of impossible resonance, naming him, unrelenting, unyielding. It pressed through bone, through muscle, into memory, and it would not stop. Neighbors began to leave. Some fled to distant towns, but the echoes followed, and those who remained learned to whisper, to move quietly, to avoid empty streets and bricked windows. The abbey remained, the robes folded at the altar, pews overturned, organ dismantled, bricks sealing the doors, but the hymn endured. It threaded through stone, through timber, through fog. It pressed against minds, shaping thoughts, twisting memory. Faith collapsed, not with argument, not with heresy, not with scandal, but with sound itself, and the valley remained heavy with it, the sound that would not end. Voices gone, yet everywhere. Father Benoit passed the burned house one last time, hands trembling, eyes hollow, and he whispered, silently, a prayer he could not hear. The survivors, silent, haunted, unraveling, knew the truth. The hymn had claimed more than bodies. It had claimed minds. It had claimed faith. And in its persistence, it would claim all who listened too closely. The village remained empty of belief. The faithful no longer gathered. The abbey stood as a monument to impossible sound, and every night, the fog carried the faintest trace of 30 voices, calling names, whispering notes, folding time and memory into themselves, and so it continues, always. Every echo a reminder that sound can endure beyond life, that faith can collapse without question, without rebellion, without heresy, because sometimes, the simplest thing, an impossible hymn, can unmake a village, and there is no returning. Mist hung over the valley like a shroud, curling around trees, rooftops, and the fractured stones of the abbey. Sunlight barely pierced the fog, leaving the ruins in a grey wash of shadow and wet stone. The towers leaned, weathered, blackened by centuries, but they still pressed against the sky with stubborn defiance. Pilgrims approached along the winding road, cloaks damp with dew, boots crunching against gravel. They whispered to one another, nervous, tentative. No one spoke loudly. Even their own footsteps seemed too loud in the hush that hung over the place. The first to reach the abbey
paused at the crumbling threshold. Hands rested on stone that had survived centuries, yet bore the memory of impossible sound. The air was damp, smelled of moss, ash, and something older, something unnameable. Inside the nave yawned empty and hollow, pews splintered, hymnals yellowed, pages curling, dust hung in shafts of morning light, floating like fragile specters over the floor. A pilgrim stepped further, and the first faint note reached them, almost imperceptible, a memory, pressed into stone, not a choir, not a voice, and yet unmistakably there. But something wasn't right. Another pilgrim followed, curious despite the hush. The air pressed on the chest, breath caught in throats, and the note persisted, threading through the arches, folding against itself in impossible harmonics. And that's when he heard it, a syllable, single, drawn from nowhere, yet unmistakably clear, calling him, naming him, resonating against memory, pressing deep into the chest. He froze, hand on the edge of a pew, eyes wide. Shadows clung to the walls, not corporeal, not moving independently, but attentive, watching, waiting. The pilgrims ventured further, moving carefully through splintered pews, broken hymnals, and the dust of centuries. Every step pressed against the memory of the hymn. A hum threaded through floorboards, through the gaps in stone, through the very air. Some dared to kneel at the altar. Folded robes of the vanished choir lay in place, undisturbed by time. Hands rested on them, and the sound responded, not fully formed, but present, insistent. It threaded through the fingertips, pressed into the chest, tugged at the throat. The abbey seemed to breathe. The walls vibrated faintly. The silence was heavy, pregnant with sound that refused to die. Pilgrims spoke in whispers, sometimes forgetting themselves. They documented what they could, notes in journals, sketches of the nave, the folded robes, the splintered pews, but the sound could not be captured. Ink failed, paper trembled, memory bent under its pressure. Outside, the valley remained shrouded in fog. Wind carried faint echoes across fields, teasing the ears, but never allowing clarity. Birds avoided the abbey. The ground seemed to hum faintly underfoot. Stories persisted, rumors of the final note, of the choir, waiting for anyone bold enough to finish the hymn. Some claimed the church had warned silently. Archived letters never circulated. Others swore the diocese had bricked the abbey, dismantled the organ, and fled. But no voice had truly addressed the truth. One pilgrim attempted to read an old hymnal. The pages crumbled under touch, ink blurred into dust, and still the note persisted, threading through paper, through stone, through the mind. Every page whispered names, faintly, impossibly. They slept uneasily nearby. Dreams were threaded with notes that could not exist, voices naming them, in impossible harmonies, impossible tones. Even awake, the memory of sound lingered, pressing in the chest, tugging at the throat. Father Benoit's journal, found in the village archives, recounted similar experience. He had walked the ruins, hands folded, lips unmoving. The hymn persisted in his mind, long after he left. Every shadow, every draft of wind, pressed the memory closer, and that's when some pilgrims began to change. One began whispering names in sleep. Another traced circles in chalk across the floor, claiming the sound could be caught. A third abandoned his companions, wandering alone into the nave, whispering notes that did not exist in any human language. The faint echoes responded, threading through the stones, through air, through memory. It was impossible to leave untouched. The final note pressed upon minds, like a hand insistent, patient. Every hour in the abbey, every step, every pause made them hear it more clearly. The church remained silent. No investigation, no declaration, only the unspoken warning. Never sing past the final note. And yet curiosity persisted. Pilgrims lingered longer than reason allowed. Eyes traced arches, fingers brushed stone, warmed by memory. Every sound, every shadow, was a presence. At night, fog wrapped the abbey like a veil. Shadows moved across bricked windows. Voices deepened, notes layered over one another, calling names. threading into dreams. Those who stayed too long could not distinguish memory from reality. Some left, pale and shaken, never speaking of the sound. Others returned to sleep and awake in the village. But the note persisted, threaded through the valley, through timber and stone, through their bones and thoughts. Survivors reported faint melodies, drifting even decades later. Names whispered, shadows waiting, the abbey silent, yet attentive. Faith remained fragile. Curiosity clashed with terror. No one dared finish the hymn, but the memory of it lingered, pressing, insistent, unyielding. And so the abbey endures, a ruin, patient, waiting, a place where sound outlives life, where the faithful may falter, but the hymn endures, where the final note waits, and always, quietly, the abbey calls. What if salvation was never meant to be sung aloud? What if faith, when stretched beyond silence, only echoes into the void?